Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
It seems as though the enlightened people, the people with broader perspective and a greater feel for the dignity of the human person, can go back to this great statements like this, pull them out as a rallying cry, and hold them up to governments and say, why are you not going along with all of this?
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Father Charles Ritter, Director of the Office of Community Relations for the Diocese of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Father Charles Ritter discuss human rights, political and civil. Here's Father Bacik.
Chuck, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with me on this program. I want to talk in general about human rights, a topic which is of current interest because of the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights made by the United Nations back in December 10th of 1948. So that makes it a current kind of topic, and I want to discuss in general this whole question of human rights. It pertains a lot to your kind of work in our Office of Community Relations, and I think that perhaps we can have an interesting discussion on this topic.
It is 36 years since the UN put that out, and just the very fact that I think as you raise that question, some of the people listening are probably saying, human rights, what is that? Says that it's still an area that there's a lot of work to be done on. There's a sense that that's something far removed from the ordinary day-to-day life of folks here in the States, especially as we talk about human rights in the world community. And I think the opportunity to talk about it and the upcoming program that the Justice and Peace Center is going to be doing is kind of an educational thing from our point of view.
You're right. When you talk about this whole topic of human rights, it begins to sound very abstract, and I think it's important to put a human face on it to begin with. I suppose we've had the human face put on it quite clearly on our television sets in the recent past with looking at the starving people from Ethiopia and getting a greater sense of what is going on in Africa, and we see there a violation of a fundamental human right to have sustenance, food, kind of things that one needs for a decent kind of human life. So you begin to, that's where it becomes graphic for us. I suppose it comes to us, too, in terms of political prisoners these days. It's always a very touchy kind of topic. We have all the things that Amnesty International reveals to us about the torture of political prisoners and so on. And we think of the Gulag in Soviet Russia and what Solzhenitsyn has told us about that, and the things that we've learned about the repression in that situation. And we say Sakharov in the news, the dissidents in Russia and the kind of persecution they undergo because they want to speak out for human rights in their own country and so on. So we begin to get that human face on it. That's when we know what human rights is probably all about.
Well, and equally present in the press, you have situations like the whole investigation at this point trying to unravel the whole situation with the shooting of Benigno Aquino in the Philippines, the dissident political leader who was shot down coming back to the Philippines, by whom, of course, still being under investigation. You have just in the paper the other night, saw two people, including a U.S. congressman from Michigan, who were arrested as part of a sit-in protest in South Africa, protesting South Africa's apartheid racial policies. And as you say, taking it down to real live people and real live situations kind of maybe helps to bridge that gap a little bit.
As you're talking, you could probably go through the newspaper on any given day and analyze it in terms of the violations of human rights that occur there. And as you suggest, I mean, if we looked at Central America and some of the dictatorships there, the Pinochet regime, and all of the disappearing people that we've had there, and people can't even find out what has happened to their relatives. People who, and now many times it seems just to be random sort of torture, that it seems to be governmental policy in some places just to inflict torture to put the people in a posture of fear. I think I was reading recently in a homily that someone gave that back in, I think it was in 1910, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and talking about torture, said that torture was no longer a part of the human scene. You know, it was a relic of the past. It's something they used to do in the old days. And here we are now in our own time with Amnesty International bringing to our minds this tremendous problem of torture around the world as a rebirth of that horrible kind of thing. I suppose we associate it with the Holocaust, with the Jewish people in Nazi Germany, with any of the dissidents that Hitler didn't like. And now we see it, all of these violations around the world, where there seems to be almost places systematic attempts to keep people in line through this horrible, horrible instrument known as torture. It often thinks, you know, it's a violation of the most fundamental human rights. I mean, just the right to life, to liberty, to have a decent kind of living, to one's own body, one's personhood. It's just a horrible kind of thing. I know Amnesty International, an organization that is devoted to overcoming torture and respecting the rights of political prisoners in our own time, documents much of this, and they ask people to write letters, of course, in relationship to that. But I'm just trying to get at the problem now, and for me, that heightens. I mean, I can. It's hard for me even to talk about it. It's such an infringement and such a horrible thing to think about.
And so foreign to our American experience, we assume, for I suppose a lot of reasons, that much of the world, at least those nations that we kind of pin a label of, you know, developed or civilized, nations that are in one way or another our allies, we kind of assume a style of life, of conduct, of the way of going about the life of political society that's like our own. And it's only when there are situations that either through the media or through first-hand contact with life in those situations, talking with people that are part of that society, we begin to find out that some of the things that we assume, not only the gross kind of things like physical torture, but all of the things that we in America would lump under the whole concept of equal protection of the law, simply does not happen in many of those societies. The UN Declaration talks about the right to freedom from arbitrary arrest, detention, and exile, and that is the normal reality of life for large numbers of people in many nations of the world, among them many that, you know, are kind of our allies. They're in our public image good folks. They're not the enemy. And that tendency that we have to project the American experience into the rest of the world community, and then to find out at times rather embarrassingly or kind of almost in a shocking way that we don't know how to react to it, that's not the case at all. We enjoy a tremendous scope of rights in the United States, and I think just kind of assume sometimes that those rights are enjoyed elsewhere, and they're not.
That's an interesting question to pick apart a little bit, Chuck. Let's talk about that, because there's a couple ways of thinking about that. One, I think, is that there is sort of a unique American experience that celebrates political and civil rights. It goes back to the founding of our country and our Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution with the Bill of Rights, and the whole notion that there are certain unalienable rights given to us by the Creator, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's sort of built into our understanding of what human existence is to be all about. And we've got this idea, you know, the right of assembly and trying to protect the individual against too great a concentration of power in the hands of government and so on. So we, in our own country, we do have a whole history of this, and we've been influential in the whole history of the world. I think as a Christian person looks at all of this, what is interesting is the way that civil society in many ways seems to have moved ahead of the church as far as systematizing and pulling together and articulating this whole business of human rights. And I think there's historical reasons for that. A lot of the church problem in the 18th, 19th century with talk of human rights was that it was leading to an excessive individualism, and that had to be careful of a lot of that language. So we've got, I think you're right in saying in the United States we have a general feel for this question, but there's also ways in which I think that there's a counterpoint to this. One of his example is when people often are interviewed and asked about whether they would affirm various elements of the Bill of Rights, say no to that in the United States. You know, I think it's partly the problem of fear. It's partly the problem of the 60s image that was given, and there's a sense in which you know, American people seem to be upset with that kind of great license as they see it, or freedom. But I mean, I think that's a very disturbing element. Every now and then you see that in the news, that they will take a poll and people will say no to one of the other elements of the Bill of Rights. And so I think we have to consider that when we're looking at our own country.
What I see happening in our own country is, again, in part because of the historical sense that was a very upfront and explicit part of the whole founding of the country. That focus, largely out of the experience of the European countries in which the colonists had come, that explicit focus that this is a part of the American identity, and the way that we continue to openly and upfront deal with it. I'm just thinking of the recent series on public television, on the series on the Constitution, and this kind of ongoing, out in the open public debate about this question of rights and law in our society. The other is the awareness that in so many of these issues we're talking about, I suppose I might even use the term rights in conflict, where what we experience is that my right to, say, privacy and your right to, whether it be a place to live or rights related to employment or something like that, even those may be more economic rights, where a sense that my rights and your rights are in conflict with one another, where my exercising my rights is infringing upon yours or vice versa. That's the one that we continue to struggle with, and it's almost as though we've not, in some cases, successfully found a way to allow both you and I to at the same time enjoy and express and live out, you know, those rights.
I like the way you've put that in sort of an evolutionary context, a developmental context, because I think we do have these ideals about the unalienable rights, as it was said, that all people enjoy, and it seems as though we've sort of gradually caught up with that ideal. So look at, for so long, women didn't have fundamental political right to vote in the United States. I mean, here you had slavery going on, and it was only in the 60s with the civil rights legislation that we caught up with some of that. And I think there's many ways in which we feel that maybe the full range of civil and political rights are not totally available to people today. So that in a developmental context, we see that we've had ideals in this country and are trying to live up to those. And it seems as though at various points in our history, the best of our idealism comes forward and says, hey, let's include more people in this. Of course, you know that many people would be saying today that, you know, one group that's excluded are the unborn. That somehow the unborn are not pulled into this grouping of all men who have unalienable rights, all human beings, as we would like to say today. So that it seems as though the struggle goes on, and there's a greater enlightenment that occurs. And the 60s would, in my mind, be a great example of that, when we were able to get the civil rights legislation passed, which of course helped our minority people in many ways, to the voting rights legislation and so on.
Another parallel that, in part because I work closely with it around some issues with migrant farm workers, the right of people in agriculture, who've traditionally not, as in industrial labor, been involved in the organized labor situations much, the right of farm workers to organize. Someone was pointing out the other day, a group that we were discussing this, that sometimes the reaction to that issue is, gee, you know, this is something that's never been done before, it's kind of hard to get a handle on, it's a very complex kind of thing. And someone pointed out, again, in this cultural conditioning and this evolution, if you went back to large parts of the United States in the 1890s and talked about extensive political involvement of the black community, that said, oh, now you got to be reasonable, that's not the way the system is set up, it's too big, you can't get a handle on it. Ditto for women's issues. We can list all sorts of situations just in our own American experience where if you go back 20, 30, 50, 100 years maybe, the analysis of the scene would be, it's impossible, you're trying to redo the whole society, it can't be done, but you look at it today and it's been done. And that sense, as you say, that coming to grips with how we actualize whether it be in our American Constitution or just kind of those things that even if they're not down in writing are kind of sort of inherently part of, I suppose it's called the American dream, that we keep struggling to make those happen. And when we run into pieces of it that in our own present experience experience, we say, oh, gee, that's a nice ideal, but it's impossible. You can't really get there. I find it helpful to have people point out that that's exactly what we said about a whole bunch of things 30, 40, 50 years ago, but we've gotten there. And so we can probably get there with the ones that we haven't worked out yet either.
We even had that in the whole labor movement.
Sure.
The impossibility of the working person to ever get any clout vis-a-vis the industrialists. And here eventually the laboring person was able to organize and to become a powerful force in negotiations. Chuck, there's another way in which I wanted to pick up on your comment about, the United States having certain standards. And this, what I find interesting is this whole business of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the General Assembly of the United Nations back in 1948, as we said before, December 10th, the anniversary of that. That we get all of the countries involved at that time affirming these great rights. I mean, it's sort of hard to understand how that could even be accomplished. It's not that everyone has lived up to them, obviously, and yet it is not unlike our own Declaration of Independence and Constitution, where some enlightened people were able to come up with high ideals that people then work to try to achieve. So we have in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights a preamble that says that we recognize the inherent dignity of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, which is a foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So we get an affirmation by, remember that the Soviet bloc countries would have been involved in this kind of affirmation. And then it leads to these 30 statements here of different kinds of rights that people have, a lot of them being civil and political rights to life, liberty, security of person, to freedom from slavery, freedom from torture, recognition as a person before the law, equal protection of the law, peaceful assembly, to take part in government, equal access to public service, and so on. So there we have, now without saying all of them, but we've got a whole bunch of rights that the human family has equal, and it says in there there's to be no discrimination on these according to sex, race, national origin, no discrimination of any kind. Just every human being has those kinds of civil and political rights, as well as other rights, but to concentrate on those. So that this is a remarkable thing in 1948 to come up with this. I think historically part of the reason for that is the backdrop of the Second World War, the uncovering of the war crimes and the attempts at genocide against the Jewish people. The whole Holocaust thing, I suppose, set the backdrop for a revulsion against this kind of thing, and therefore this very strong and helpful statement, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights put out by the United Nations.
I think, too, there's the need to, again, looking at the human process by which things little by little move from words on paper to reality. I'm sure a number of people think, gee, that's 1948, that's 36 years ago. You look at the nations, who accepted and concurred in that Declaration of Human Rights, and if you were a cynic, you would be tempted to laugh at the reality of life in those nations as compared to that declaration. But the only way, as a matter of fact, that you incorporate in the actual living of life an ideal is to explicitly deal with it, to keep bringing it up, to keep using it as a frame of reference, to keep holding it up, as a norm against which you measure behavior, to use the legitimate pressure of what in the community of nations can be created as a sense of common commitment to those kinds of rights. And it would be interesting to trace over the years how pieces that started out as that declaration have little by little in either national codes of law or in various international legal documents been little by little have been things that have moved from simply this non-legal declaration to actual established law. It's a slow process, but like any such process, unless you have an explicit frame of reference that people are willing to say, we want to try to keep building around this, and every time we fail to live up to this, we want to come back to it as a standard rather than throw out the standard and say it's unrealistic, let's forget it.
Yeah, I mean, just think of something like the Helsinki agreements. It's commonly said, well, the Russians just violate those, or that the Russians, the Soviet regime violates this Universal Declaration of Human human rights, and yet the Soviet dissidents have been able to rally around that.
Right.
They've been able to say, hey, look, we signed this, and we're not living up to it. And so it seems as though the enlightened people, the people with broader perspective and a greater feel for the dignity of the human person, can go back to this great statements like this, pull them out as a rallying cry, and hold them up to governments and say, why are you not going along with all of this? So I do think that it is a valuable document. I think it's a shame that it's not better known. Didn't you say before something about there's going to be an effort to get this known in some ways? But
that's a continuing effort. Yes.
Yeah, to try to talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, I think during this time of the year and before Christmas, the month of December 10th anniversary, and so on, there's a lot of programs going on and efforts to get that known. But what we're after right here, I think, is the value of it as a statement of ideals, that people have all of these rights to freedom from arbitrary interference with privacy, family, home, or correspondence, to freedom of movement and residence, freedom to seek asylum, to marry and found a family, to own property, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. All of those things, are really valuable, and we have to latch on to them.
One of the things that, as you talk about, making this better known, a number of organizations have each year around the 10th of December, which is the date of the promulgation of the Declaration of Human Rights in '48, have done various kinds of community awareness programs. The Justice and Peace Center locally here in Toledo is going to be doing a program that night. And the focus of the program this year, I think, picks up an aspect of this, because as we talk about this, it seems like, well, gee, that's fine for the United Nations to talk about, and governments are either going to do or not do things around this.